LinkedIn and on YouTube. So I'm just waiting a couple of seconds for the live streaming to come through, and then we'll get started on the show. Hold on a minute. Yep, that all looks really good and really nice. Awesome. Good. Let us get started with the show for today. Welcome to the Master Your Exit show powered by The Big Exit. I'm Lynn, and together with Graham Stephen, we'll be hosting the show today. On this Master Your Exit live show, we bring very practical insights, we bring expert interviews, we bring tools to help small business owners like you prepare for your big exit. This live show airs every Tuesday at 7 a.m. in Los Angeles, 10 a.m. in New York, and 3 p.m. in London time. We keep each show short and simple, 30 minutes maximum. Now, if you're tuning in live on YouTube or on our LinkedIn channel, welcome. Happy to have you here. If you're joining us live here in our virtual Zoom studio, that's awesome too. You can drop in your exit-related questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them on this show or next week's show or any future episodes. If you're catching this episode later in a replay version, you can find all of the episodes of the show on our website, thebigexit.co/master your exit shows. Master Your Exit shows, or listen to the audio version on your favorite podcast platform. And in today's show, we'll chat about something that really no one wants to talk about. At least this is from my experience, because it's kind of a little bit boring, but really important in the process of preparing your business for an exit. And that's legal documents. Now, small disclaimer, nor Graham or myself, we are legal advisors or legal experts. We are both small business owners. So what we are sharing today on the show comes from our personal experience as owners or from the clients that we have worked with, which are small business owners looking to sell their business and are in the process of preparing for an exit. Now, before we maybe share some insights on, like how legal documents have an influence on the value of your business, and maybe also before we share some cautionary tales with you, let's maybe start with talking about the kind of legal documents one needs as an absolute bare minimum when thinking about selling. So let's start a little bit with that. What are like the key documents, Graham, that you see that are as an absolute bare minimum required if you're thinking about eventually selling your business?
Lynn, that's a great question. I mean, when you think of legal documentation, most of us run a mile. It's quite a scary topic. You think of, signing T's and C's on an online subscription that nobody reads, and you just click continue. But when you're selling a business or thinking about a business, there are some really important documents that you need to think about. And I'd always encourage somebody to get pragmatic legal advice from a kind of law firm or legal firm that deals with small businesses, and there are a number of them out there. You don't need one of the big law firms that's going to charge you an arm and a leg. There's some basics that you need, and I would say, there's probably three that you need to think about as a business owner that carry a lot of weight. The first one is, and in different countries and jurisdictions, these are sometimes called different things, but your shareholder agreement or your memorandum of incorporation, if it's a company. But basically, this is an agreement that basically says how you as a shareholder or with other shareholders, so if you've got more than one shareholder, how you engage with each other. What happens in the event of a dispute? What happens in the event of you want to sell the business? What are the rights and obligations of the shareholders and the directors in that business? What happens if one leaves? So that shareholder agreement is really important because it defines the rules of engagement in terms of how the existing shareholders or owners of the business engage with each other. And then when you sell the business, if you're selling a portion of the business, for instance, as opposed to your whole business, you would engage in a new shareholder agreement that defines how you as an owner who's potentially staying on as a minority or whatever shareholder, what your rights and obligations are compared to the new shareholder. So those shareholder agreements are super important, both before you're thinking of selling, but also sometimes post a sale if it's not 100% buyout. Very, very important document. The second,
Just just to
yeah, go
dive
for it.
into that just a little bit more with the shareholder agreement. Lots of our clients are solo entrepreneurs, as in they are the only shareholders.
Yeah.
100% ownership. There's no external capital. There's no other investors involved, no other shareholders.
Mm.
What about the shareholder agreement in that case?
I mean, in that instance, the shareholder agreement is probably less relevant. Okay, so there is a relevance, and I'll explain it now. The incorporation document or the memorandum of incorporation, that's important that that's, still constituted well. And some of the reasons for that is, what happens if you're the sole shareholder, you've got employees, you may have employees or people that you contracting to you. What happens if something happens to you? What happens if you die? What happens if you get injured? Okay. There needs to be almost a founding document that specifies what happens. Does your spouse take over the business? Do the employees have an option to buy the business? So even in the case of a sole owner, it is important to think these things through. It doesn't always have to be complicated, but it does need to be documented. And then, the point I touched on just now, if you're a sole shareholder, and you selling your business to somebody else or a portion of your business to somebody else, it's critical then that you think about, a shareholder agreement with a new party. And you may never have been exposed to this as a sole shareholder before. So, what your future relationship looks like, think of it a little bit like if you're going to get married, you may have been single your whole life, you go through that prenup or marriage contract. So in that instance, it becomes important post sale. So those are a couple of use cases where I think it is important, even as a solo founder.
Yeah. In case you don't have a shareholder agreement, which I know exists as well, like one of my friends is currently buying out his co-founder, yet they have never created any kind of shareholder agreement. Now,
Yeah.
they are in very good terms, so they can negotiate their way around buying out the co-founder in a constructive way and in a fruitful way and in a win-win way, which is a blessing, obviously. But I wanted to mention this story because even it happens quite often. You're just two young kids with an idea, starting to
Mm,
work it out, make it happen. The business starts taking off, and you're doing a million things, and probably crafting a shareholder agreement is not one of the things in your top
mm,
50 list of things that you do. Whether you should do them is something else. Now, just if you are in that situation and there is no shareholder agreement in place, I think you can still put it in place, right? So, as a preparation of a lot of instances, and exiting being one of those instances. So, even if you don't have it right now, it's worthwhile and you should be doing it if you're building your business in a way that makes exiting, a
mm.
pathway that you can walk on.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's move on to the next one then. Okay. And so we've spoken about shareholder agreements. The other one is, let's think about operations of a business. We talk about having robust terms and conditions. Okay. And this can
Yeah.
span a range of things, but this basically tells when a buyer is buying your business, obviously they're buying a future revenue stream. So how do you engage with your customers? Okay. Your suppliers. Okay. So those kind of operational terms and conditions are important. How do you deal with data privacy, for argument's sake? Okay.
Mhm.
So most important is your terms and conditions in terms of how do customers engage with you. So what happens if there's something goes wrong with the product that you're selling? What happens if there's a dispute? What happens if you breach the confidentiality of their data? Are there any warranty terms and conditions attached to the service? So if somebody's buying your business, they're going to want to know if you've made a warranty commitment to a client that, they can bring that product back for the next 100 years. And if it's broken, you'll replace it with a new one. A buyer's going to want to know about that. So, your terms and conditions are important. They're important. It's also important that they, understandable and pragmatic. Just because you've got a 300-page T's and C's, which nobody reads, doesn't mean that you're covered. In fact, it's probably better to have a simple set of T's and C's that cover the most
Agree.
important aspects of how you're trading. It's not about hiding behind them. It's just about stating how do you engage as a business. And often highly complex terms and conditions can sometimes be a red flag to a potential acquirer. What are you hiding in these terms and conditions? Okay. If you have a one page that says, yeah, the rules of engagement. Okay. Yeah. If you do work with us, you pay up front. If we deliver the work, um, and it's not to your standard, here's the dispute process. And, lay it out in simple, plain language as opposed to legalese. But it is important. I mean, with our business, we operate across territories for argument's sake. So the UK, the US, and we've had to get attorneys to come in and have a look and say, are your T's and C's appropriate? For example, in the UK, they have GDPR, which is a Data Protection Act. They've got a different act or different legislation in the US for dealing with that. So, you have to, I think, get some professional advice here, and make sure it's documented. And a buyer of your business will look at these things and see what you've got in place. Equally,
Agree.
your
Can
suppliers.
I add to that? Can I add just a
Yeah,
little bit of
absolutely.
experience
I'm
to
going on
that
a
as
roll,
well?
yeah.
Because I remember the first few years that I was in business, we didn't have terms and conditions. Like, hence, sorry about that, but we didn't.
Yeah,
And we were winging it. Literally, we were just winging it. When issues arise in your relationships with your suppliers or your clients, you're kind of like you're trying to solve them on the fly.
yeah,
But at some point, that just doesn't become very productive anyway and very efficient anyway either, because you're managing case by case situations, which is fine when you have a handful of clients, but it doesn't work when you have a couple of hundred, right? So I felt like making these terms and conditions felt like a rite of passage into a next level of professionalism for the
yeah,
business. And we did it once, or we did it for the first time when we started to have a significant amount of clients, where we
mm,
needed, where I also needed my team to understand what the terms and conditions were, because if they had to ask me all the time, hey, a client is asking this, like, how should we handle this? Or,
yeah,
hey, there's like a client who's not happy with this program, like, how should they ask for a refund? How should we go about doing that? And it was like, we need to kind of define how we're going to handle these things in a
yeah,
structured way. And that basically became the basis of our terms and conditions. And
mm,
then, as you were saying, rightfully, we had to readjust them when we changed our business model to a subscription-based model, and the terms and conditions changed. And then we
yeah,
had to rework them again with our lawyer when we got internationally active, because certain things change depending on the law in certain countries and the compliance that is required there. So for me, it's kind of like a coming of age and something that needs to grow with you and your business and the amount of clients that you have and the territory that you have, and also your team. Like, we considered our terms and conditions as a key training document for our team as well, so they knew how to handle certain situations too. And
yeah,
you've also mentioned a little bit briefly about privacy conditions and like GDPR compliance and stuff like that, which, like, when you're part of the European Union, there's a couple of requirements that you have there too. And it's actually required to have, like, not only your terms and conditions, but also your privacy
mm,
agreement and how you deal with data and data protection, to have those things on your website too. So clients can read them and know what they're signing up for, basically, when they buy something from you online, for example. So, and I love how you've mentioned this. We've always worked with lawyers who could translate how we worked into a legal document,
yeah,
rather than them creating a legal document we didn't even understand. So I thought that was really important for us when we were building these terms and conditions. It's like, hey, this is how we work,
mm,
translated into something that is legally solid, rather than giving us a template that we don't even understand ourselves. So that's kind of like, I think, a tip when you're working or choosing a lawyer to work with. And we work with lawyers together that I'm happy to recommend to anybody within our community of the Big Exit. But like, if you're vetting for a lawyer, make sure you find a lawyer that is willing to speak your language in the terms and conditions that they're building. Like, that would be my personal experience as a business owner.
Absolutely. I think just something to touch on as well. Don't do terms and conditions. Yes, it's important from compliance perspective, but we speak about this a lot, is moving away from owner dependence and having systems and processes that your business runs off. It actually goes hand in hand with your terms and conditions. So when you're building those processes, think about how you do business, what those processes are, how they work, what happens. Ask yourself these questions. Your operating manual and procedures and the way that you build and scale and automate your systems and processes is almost a proxy for your legal documents. So those two things can actually be done hand in hand. The way they're implemented might not always sync completely, but you can kind of kill two birds with one stone if you think about that, in conjunction with each other.
Gotcha. So we've already talked about shareholder agreement, key important document when preparing for an exit or in any phase of the business, basically, but definitely when preparing for an exit, shareholder agreement. The second one, having your terms and conditions in place. What's the third one?
Okay, now the third one I think is super important. A lot of the businesses we deal with are businesses which are maybe agencies or knowledge businesses, software as a service businesses, and underneath all of that, it's often pinned by IP, okay, or patents or protection around that. So you've got this
Yeah.
unique idea that you've built something with. And I think that's absolutely critical. If you've got this unique idea that perhaps is a potential patent or something along those lines around it, you've got to make sure that that is properly locked down. Because IP can give your business massive value. If you've got this, I don't know, let's say you come up with the fountain of the elixir of youth. You drink from this bottle and it makes you perpetually 30 years old. Okay. Now imagine if you could invent that, how
And the
valuable that
gray hair disappeared, and don't we all want
exactly.
that?
But I mean, the protection around that is absolutely key. That's why patent lawyers are, I think, some of the highest paid lawyers in the world, because you got to protect against being able to copy. So IP assignment and protection is absolutely critical. So you own that you create. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but where you set that up is also really, really important.
Yeah.
And I just want to touch on this. Sometimes people come up with this idea and they think, okay, they're going to create the patent or IP and house it in some offshore structure with a low tax jurisdiction and all of those sorts of things. Then suddenly they get approached by a US or a UK company that wants to acquire them. And it's difficult for them to do the deal because when they're doing the due diligence, suddenly you're looking at this obscure island somewhere which doesn't maybe have all the same protections that, having your IP registered in the Netherlands or the UK or, the US might have. So, yeah, again, I'm not an IP lawyer, but I know the importance of that.
Yeah.
And it can be quite
100%.
expensive. Okay. And that's why I think a lot of owners and founders kind of shy away from it. And also, a lot of countries have different rules around IP. IP often sits in the country that it's been originated in. You can't simply just move IP from country to country and that. So this is an area where if you've got a business that has got, maybe let me simplify it as well, things like trademarks, your brand, your image, that's also classified as IP. So that's a lot easier, but I would strongly suggest that if you're in the business that has got an IP, a brand element or anything like that, is consult an IP or a brand lawyer and make sure you register your trademarks, you got the right protection over those things, because it makes a massive difference down the line.
Yeah, 100%. And within our community and the Seven Figure Exit program, we have a couple of lawyers who specialize in IP, sorry, for small business owners. Some based in the US, some based in Europe, because they often specialize as well in a certain jurisdiction or a certain geography. And if you are a service-based business, because a lot of service-based businesses will say, oh, I don't have any IP. I'm just doing projects for clients.
Mm.
I do like marketing optimizations, or I do this, or I do that, or I do like financial planning, or, they do this service that they offer and they believe they don't have IP, maybe the name of their company, which isn't that valuable, but the name of their company or their logo or whatever. And they keep coming back to me saying, I don't have any IP, which is not true. It's simply not
Mm.
true for most service-based businesses or agencies or, professional services. You have a certain way of working that is probably a framework,
Yeah.
a set of steps and procedures that you're following every single time for projects with clients that gets them those results. That in and of itself is IP that you have been building. It might be templates that you have been developing for your, not just for your clients, but internally developed to help your clients, for example. That's
Yeah.
IP too. Maybe you have a program that has a certain name. Like, for example, at the Big Exit, we have a program which is called the Seven Figure Exit Program. That in and of itself is IP. There's a whole bunch of things that could be protected in your business. And we have some incredible IP lawyers that work specifically in certain areas and know what it means to protect IP for service-based businesses and agencies.
Yeah.
Not all lawyers know that, but I just want to stretch that if you're in that space, there's so much IP you can protect there, which increases the value of your business dramatically. So that's the third document, IP-related legal documents besides shareholder agreement and the terms and conditions. And I think those three are the most important ones. Now, how do they drive value in the business? Like, let's say I don't have these and I'm
Mm.
thinking of selling. Should I get them? Is it too late to get them? Like, what does, if I don't have them and I'm selling my business, is this going to tank any potential deal? Like,
Yeah.
how should I go about with this if I don't have any of these things, for example?
So I'm going to answer that in hopefully quite a simplistic way, and I'm going to kind of wrap it all together because I think, this will bring it all together quite nicely. First thing with all these is it's never too late to put these things in place. Okay, so if you don't have them, don't panic. Okay. Second thing is, make them simple and make them pragmatic, but get legal advice so that it's done. So let's just put that to one side.
Yeah.
Like I explained just now, when it comes to terms and conditions, using that as a mechanism to actually help systematize and document your business. Okay. That's where I think there's real business value in the one hand in doing that. So IP protection is an example. So this is the one area why it creates value is if you're thinking about IP, you've got to think about your value proposition. You've got to think about what makes you different. And as you say, it could be, hey, we've got a particular process, which is a framework that we can wrap up and put it in a bow and sell that. Okay. So going through these processes, can help you to do that. Your terms and conditions, your shareholder agreement, that's maybe slightly different. Why is that important in terms of creating value? A potential acquirer usually wants to de-risk the business. So it means, they need to be sure that the business can continue to exist if you, as the owner, are no longer involved. Okay, so terms and conditions that are supported by, proper procedures and operating manuals. Cool, that takes away owner dependence. A shareholder agreement that's thought about the risks of like what happens if one of the shareholders dies. Okay, it demonstrates that you've been through a thought process. And I think there's inherent value in that. Beyond the
Yeah.
agreements themselves, I think the real value in this stuff is, from a business value point of view, is what does it represent? What's the thought process that's gone? So if you're just doing these things as a tick box exercise, I would argue that it doesn't add any value, okay, other than maybe getting you through a legal due diligence exercise. The real value is the thought process that underpins each of these. The last point I want to make
So
is
true.
in a big deal, people will go and they'll check these things. So depending on who's acquiring you down the line, you can fail a due diligence sometimes if you don't have customer terms and conditions in place. And this is simply the way that a due diligence firm might go around actually checking these things. Okay. And in many instances, it can be a deal breaker. Like if you don't have audited financial statements and you've got a fund buying into you, they might insist on that. It could sink the deal. So, there's the tick box element of it to pass due diligence. But yeah, looping back, it's really about the thought process that goes into these things, and that creates the value. It reduces risk, reduces owner dependency, and it specifies what happens if something goes wrong. So yeah, that would be my take on it, Lynn.
Yeah, 100%. And I can only uh, how do you say that, testify to that as well. And I think specifically that experience of building these legal documents. I mean, we started building these out because we knew we needed them, and it was like a checkbox exercise. But when we
Mm.
were going through it, it was like, hold on, wait a minute. This really helps us think about how we handle certain things within the business. So there was a lot of business value that came into that. And yes, it's an expensive exercise to go through, but I think it definitely helped us to professionalize the way that we were doing things and clarifying, some of the most important things with the team as well, to make sure that we kind of
Mm.
aligned certain things. So I can totally testify to what you're saying, like from a practical standpoint. Like it's definitely true that going through that exercise of creating these documents helps you to also professionalize your business internally, and you get a lot of benefit from that. Also with the IP exercise, for example, being able to say that you have like a proper framework that is like protected, gives it some solidity and some significance more than, you know, another framework that is not a proprietary framework that got some IP protection behind it. So I can totally, like I can totally relate to that. Before we wrap up, any cautionary tales that you have heard from clients or people you've worked with, or that you feel like you want to share, or is this a whole other episode on its own?
I think that's a whole nother episode. I think if I get going now, no, no, no. Why are you putting me on the spot? And two, I think we should do an episode on that because there are real stories with that. I mean, I've had a number when it comes to just give a couple of examples. One, when it comes to sort of data and privacy policy. Okay. And a client who had a significant fine because they didn't have that in place, okay, which scuppered a deal. So that's one example. And the other was an example where there were actually some onerous terms and conditions in place for some of the client contracts, and they actually had to go back and renegotiate those contracts with clients, which was very, very difficult. Fortunately, in that case, the deal actually succeeded, but it was a very stressful period. But I think that's a whole nother episode. I
Yeah.
mean, there are so many things that can go wrong here.
Yeah. My
Um,
God, you don't want to be renegotiating client deals whilst you're in the process of selling
Negotiation to
your
sell your
business.
business. Yeah, exactly.
Good God. Okay. Yeah, we can talk about that at some other time, because I'm also keeping, we said we would keep it short and simple, and we were aiming at 20 minutes, but we're already talking for
Never
30 minutes.
happens.
So it always happens like that, right? But let's just wrap things up. So this is the wrap for this week's episode of the Master Your Exit Live show. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you're leaving with valuable insights to help you prepare for your big exit. And remember, you can catch the replay of this episode and all other episodes on our website at thebigexit.co/master your exit shows, or listen to the audio version on your favorite podcast platform. Now, we also love to hear from you. You can send in your exit related questions before next week's show by heading over to the website, thebigexit.co/master your exit signups. You can sign up there and send in your exit related questions so we can answer them on any of the future episodes. We'll be back next Tuesday at 7 a.m. in Los Angeles, 10 a.m. in New York, or 3 p.m. in London with more tips, expert interviews, and tools to help you master your exit. Until then, keep building, keep preparing, and we'll see you next week.